Chapter 1. The Shadow in His Life. The classroom buzzed with life, students chattering, laughter echoing against the walls, the scraping of chairs as people settled in. Tim Sinclair entered with his usual confident stride, flashing a grin at a few classmates as he made his way to his seat. His golden hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, a casual yet effortless glow surrounding him. He was, as always, the center of attention. Peter Carter, seated at the farthest desk in the corner, barely spared him a glance. Not because he wasn't aware of Tim's presence. How could anyone not be? But because he had spent the last 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible. Peter wasn't the kind of guy people noticed. With soft brown curls that always seemed slightly tousled and green eyes that most overlooked behind his thin-framed glasses, he preferred the quiet spaces, the library, his dorm, anywhere that didn't demand conversation. He was slim, not exactly athletic, and he carried himself with a certain guarded stillness that kept people at a distance. It was better that way. Less chance of getting hurt. Tim, on the other hand, was the kind of guy who thrived in the spotlight. He was effortlessly charming, with an easy smile that won people over in seconds. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of confidence that made everything seem so simple for him. He was also someone Peter had admired, from a distance, of course. Not in the way the rest of the university did, not because of his popularity or looks, but because Tim was the kind of person Peter could never be. Loud, fearless, unapologetically himself. And yet, Tim had never even acknowledged Peter's existence. Not until today. "All right, class," Professor Keating called, silencing the noise as she moved to the front of the room. "Before we begin, I have an important announcement. It appears that some of you are struggling with the recent coursework." There were a few murmurs and exchanged glances. Tim sighed dramatically, drumming his fingers against his desk. "Because of this," the professor continued, "I have selected a few of our stronger students to act as tutors. If you have been assigned one, you are expected to attend sessions. No exceptions." Tim groaned. "Great. Babysitting." A few people laughed, but Peter frowned, already dreading what was coming. Sure enough, Professor Keating glanced at her clipboard and read out the first pair. "Peter Carter, you'll be tutoring Tim Sinclair." Silence. Peter felt his stomach drop. Tim turned, his blue eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. For the first time, their gazes met. "You're Carter?" Tim asked, brows raised. Peter swallowed, nodded once. Tim let out a short laugh, shaking his head as if the situation couldn't be more ridiculous. Peter braced himself for the inevitable protest, the attempt to switch tutors, because why wouldn't he? Tim had never paid him a second of attention before today. Why would he want to start now? But to Peter's surprise, Tim didn't argue. He just leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head and said, "All right then. Hope you're ready for a challenge." Peter wasn't sure if he was. Later that evening, Peter sat at a corner table in the library, waiting. He had sent Tim the details of their first session, half expecting him not to show up. But, right as the clock struck 7, Tim walked in, scanning the shelves until he found Peter. "You're actually on time," Peter remarked. "Surprised?" Tim smirked, dropping into the chair across from him. He leaned back, hands behind his head, looking far too relaxed for someone who was supposed to be struggling with literature. "A little." Tim grinned, then glanced at the books Peter had laid out. "All right, Professor, where do we start?" Peter rolled his eyes. "You could at least pretend to care." "Who says I don't?" Tim picked up one of the books, flipping through it carelessly. "I just don't see why I have to analyze every word of something written 100 years ago. It's either a love story or someone dies tragically. What's the big deal?" Peter sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The big deal is that literature isn't just about stories. It's about themes, emotions, human experiences. That's why you're failing. You think it's just about plot." Tim tilted his head, studying him. "You really love this stuff, huh?" Peter hesitated. "Yeah, I do." There was something in the way he said it that made Tim pause. For the first time, he saw beyond the quiet exterior. Peter wasn't just some nerdy bookworm, there was passion behind his words, a fire that he didn't let people see. "Okay," Tim said, sitting up. "Teach me, then." Peter blinked. "What?" "You said I don't get it, so show me." Peter wasn't sure what had shifted, but something had. Tim was looking at him, really looking. And for the first time in years, Peter felt like maybe he wasn't invisible after all. Over the next few weeks, their sessions became something of a routine. Peter had expected Tim to get bored and ditch him, but surprisingly, he didn't. In fact, he started showing up early. Sometimes he'd bring coffee. Other times he'd complain about a long day before they even opened their books, as if their sessions had become part of his daily rhythm. It was strange, but Peter didn't question it. And then one night, everything changed. It was raining hard outside, the storm drumming against the library windows. Most students had already left, but Peter and Tim had lost track of time, deep in discussion over a particularly frustrating essay question. "Okay, so let me get this straight," Tim said, rubbing his temples. "This guy's writing an entire poem about a flower, but it's actually about, what? The meaning of life." Peter chuckled. "Close enough." Tim groaned, letting his head fall against the table. "This is torture." Peter smirked. "Maybe if you actually paid attention in class." "I'd still be confused," Tim muttered. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound the rain outside. Then Tim let out a sigh. "You ever wonder if people see you the way you see yourself?" he asked suddenly. Peter frowned. "What do you mean?" Tim shrugged. "Like you think you're one thing, but maybe everyone else sees something different." Peter considered that. "I think most people don't see me at all." Tim lifted his head, his blue eyes meeting Peter's. "I do." Peter's breath caught. It was just 2 words, simple and casual, but they landed with the force of something bigger. Something unexpected. Before Peter could say anything, the lights flickered. The storm outside roared, and the library fell into momentary darkness. Tim let out a surprised laugh. "Well, that's dramatic." Peter's pulse was still racing, not from the lights, but from the way Tim had looked at him. Like, for the first time, he wasn't the quiet shadow in the background. Like maybe, just maybe, he was someone Tim wouldn't forget. And that terrified him. Chapter 2. Sparks in the Unlikeliest Places. The air between them had changed. Peter felt it. He wasn't sure what it was, exactly. Maybe it was that moment in the library. The way Tim had said, "I do," like it actually meant something. Maybe it was the fact that Tim hadn't acted any different since then. Yet Peter could feel a subtle shift, like a static charge in the air between them. Tim still came to their tutoring sessions, still complained about literature, still made exaggerated groans every time Peter assigned him extra reading. But there were new things now, things that hadn't existed before. Tim sat closer. He leaned in when Peter spoke, eyes focused, attention real. Sometimes he asked Peter things that had nothing to do with their coursework, about his favorite books, about why he always sat alone, about the music he listened to when he thought no one was paying attention. Peter tried to ignore the way his pulse reacted. It was just curiosity. Tim was just... But then there were other moments, like the time their fingers brushed when they both reached for the same book, and instead of pulling away, Tim hesitated for just a second too long. Or the way Tim's gaze lingered sometimes, sharp and thoughtful, like he was seeing Peter in a way that no one else had before. Peter told himself it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. The campus cafe was unusually crowded that evening, filled with students escaping the rain that had begun to pour outside. Peter sat across from Tim, their usual tutoring session relocated from the library due to a power outage. "This is ridiculous," Tim grumbled, tapping his pen against his notebook. "I'm never going to understand this." Peter fought back a smile. "You understand it. You do understand it. You just don't want to admit that you're actually good at analyzing poetry." "I refuse to accept that," Tim said dramatically, pushing the book away. "Next thing I know, you'll tell me I secretly love Shakespeare." Peter smirked. "You might." Tim narrowed his eyes. "I'm starting to think you enjoy watching me suffer." Peter just shrugged. "A little." Tim let out a laugh, and for some reason the sound made something tighten in Peter's chest. He looked down at his notebook, trying to refocus. It was dangerous, these moments. Too easy to fall into something he wasn't allowed to want. Before he could retreat further into his thoughts, the door to the cafe swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through. Peter glanced up to see a familiar face walking in. Liam Hayes, one of their classmates. Tall, broad-shouldered, and confident in a way that was effortless, Liam was the type of guy people noticed. And he was walking straight toward their table. "Hey, Peter," Liam greeted, flashing a small smile. Peter blinked, caught off guard. Hey. Liam nodded at Tim before turning back to Peter. I was actually looking for you. I wanted to ask, do you want to grab a coffee sometime? Just the two of us? Peter froze. His brain short-circuited. Liam Hayes was asking him out? Tim suddenly went still beside him. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it. Ah, Liam chuckled, sensing the hesitation. No pressure, just figured I'd ask. Peter glanced at Tim instinctively. Tim's expression was unreadable, but his jaw was tight. Liam followed Peter's gaze and raised an eyebrow, then smirked. Unless you're... No, Peter said quickly. Too quickly. His face heated. I mean, I'm not, he exhaled. Sure, coffee sounds nice. Liam grinned. Cool, I'll text you. He left, and Peter swore he could still feel Tim's silence. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, what was that? Tim asked, voice light, but with an edge Peter couldn't place. Peter frowned. What do you mean? Tim shrugged. Didn't know you were into that guy. I'm not, Peter said automatically. Then he hesitated. I mean, I don't really know him. Tim leaned back in his chair. So why'd you say yes? Peter bristled. Why do you care? Tim hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I don't. Something in his tone made Peter's stomach twist. He had expected teasing, some smug comment, maybe even indifference. But instead, Tim looked bothered, and that scared Peter more than anything. Peter had planned to push the entire conversation out of his mind, but it was impossible. The next evening, they found themselves in the library again, rain drumming against the windows. Peter sat with his book open, but his mind was elsewhere. Tim was restless. Peter could tell his usual easy confidence had been replaced by something else, something almost tense. Finally, Tim exhaled sharply and set his pen down. So are you actually going out with him? Peter's head snapped up. What? Liam, Tim said. Are you actually going to go? Peter hesitated. Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't I? Tim let out a humorless laugh. I don't know, just didn't think he was your type. Peter frowned. And what exactly is my type? Tim held his gaze for a long moment. Peter's heart pounded. Then Tim looked away. Never mind, he muttered, turning back to his book. Peter stared at him, his chest tight. For the first time since they'd started these tutoring sessions, he had the terrifying feeling that he wasn't the only one feeling something. 2 nights later, Peter sat in a booth at a small cafe across from Liam. It was nice. Liam was nice. He was funny, easy to talk to. He asked about Peter's interests, about his writing, and he actually listened when Peter spoke. But something was missing. Peter couldn't stop thinking about blue eyes and golden hair and an easy grin that had been stuck in his mind for weeks. And then, as if fate had a cruel sense of humor, Peter looked up and saw him, Tim, standing near the entrance, looking directly at him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, before Peter could react, Tim turned and walked out the door. Peter's stomach twisted. His pulse was racing. He had a choice, and somehow he already knew what he was going to do. Liam, he said abruptly, standing up. I'm sorry, but I need to go. Liam raised an eyebrow, then smirked knowingly. Figured. Peter barely heard him as he grabbed his coat and hurried outside. The rain had started again, light but steady. He spotted Tim halfway down the street, hands stuffed in his pockets. Tim, Peter called. Tim didn't stop. Peter ran, catching up, grabbing his wrist. Tim turned, blue eyes unreadable. What are you doing? Peter's chest heaved. What was that back there? Tim scoffed. Nothing. Just didn't expect to see you with... He exhaled sharply. Never mind. Peter swallowed. Tim met his gaze, and Peter saw it then. Something real. Something dangerous. You were jealous, Peter whispered. Tim didn't deny it. The rain poured around them, and Peter's heart raced, knowing that everything had just changed. Chapter 3. The push and pull of something new. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, but the storm between Peter and Tim had only just begun. Peter lay awake in his dorm bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every second of what had happened outside the cafe. The way Tim had looked at him, blue eyes conflicted, guarded, yet undeniably raw. He had been right. Tim had been jealous. And yet, Peter didn't know what to do with that knowledge. Because Tim hadn't admitted it, hadn't said the words. Instead, he had just stood there, fists clenched at his sides, before muttering, "Forget it, Pete," and walking away. And Peter had let him, because what else was he supposed to do? The next day, their usual tutoring session felt different. Peter arrived first, as he always did, setting up at their usual table in the library. He kept his focus on his books, trying not to think about what Tim might say, how he might act. Would he pretend like nothing had happened? Or would he finally acknowledge what was building between them? Tim arrived 5 minutes late, hair still damp from a shower, his usual easygoing smirk in place. "Hey, Professor," he greeted, sliding into the chair across from Peter. "What literary torture do you have planned for me today?" Peter frowned, studying him. Tim was pretending, like nothing had changed. Peter clenched his jaw, pushing down the frustration bubbling inside him. If that was how Tim wanted to play it, fine. He turned back to his book. "We're analyzing the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock," Tim groaned. "Another guy whining about life and missed opportunities?" Peter's lips twitched. Something like that. They fell into their routine, and for a while Peter let himself pretend too, let himself believe that nothing had shifted. But it had. Because Tim wasn't just fidgeting in his seat, he was sneaking glances at Peter when he thought he wasn't looking. His usual playful banter was forced, like he was trying too hard to act normal. And then there was the way his knee brushed Peter's under the table. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Peter finally exhaled sharply, shutting his book. "Okay. Enough." Tim blinked. "What?" Peter folded his arms. "Are we going to talk about it, or are you just going to keep acting like nothing happened?" Tim stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Peter narrowed his eyes. "Yes, you do." A muscle in Tim's jaw ticked. He looked away, fingers drumming against the table. "Look, Pete." Peter hated that nickname, except when Tim said it. "I don't," Tim exhaled sharply. "I don't know what you want from me." Peter's stomach twisted. "I don't want anything," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it." Tim's hands curled into fists. "See what?" Peter leaned forward slightly, forcing Tim to meet his gaze. "The way you looked at me. The way you—" He swallowed. "You were jealous, Tim." Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Tim's eyes darkened, his expression guarded. "Even if I was," he said carefully, "what difference would it make?" Peter's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Tim let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter, Pete. I don't—" He exhaled sharply. "I don't do this." Peter's chest ached. "This?" Tim gestured vaguely between them. "You, me, whatever the hell this is." Peter stared at him. "Why not?" Tim hesitated. "Because I don't know what it is." Peter swallowed hard, forcing himself to hold Tim's gaze. "Then figure it out." A storm flickered behind Tim's eyes. For a moment, Peter thought he might actually say something. Then, Tim pushed his chair back abruptly and stood. "I gotta go," he muttered, grabbing his bag. Peter didn't stop him this time. He just watched him walk away. Days passed, and the silence between them stretched unbearably long. Peter went about his routine as usual, classes, studying, spending time in the library, but something felt off, like a piece of his world had shifted and he couldn't quite set it right. Tim, for his part, avoided him. He still showed up to class, still joked around with his friends, still acted like the effortlessly confident guy everyone expected him to be. But he didn't come to their tutoring sessions. He didn't sit near Peter in class. And worst of all, he didn't even look at him. Peter told himself it was for the best, that he had been stupid to let himself hope for something impossible. But the ache in his chest refused to fade. It all came to a breaking point at a party. Peter hadn't even planned to go, but his roommate Leo had insisted. "You need to get out, man. Get your mind off." He hadn't finished that sentence, but Peter knew exactly what he'd meant. So Peter went. And of course, Tim was there. Peter spotted him near the makeshift bar, drink in hand, laughing at something one of his friends said. He looked normal, like he hadn't spent the past few days avoiding Peter like the plague. Anger bubbled beneath Peter's skin. Fine. If Tim wanted to pretend like nothing had happened, then Peter could too. That was how he ended up dancing with some guy he barely knew, hands resting lightly on his waist. He wasn't even paying attention, until he felt it. A presence. He turned his head slightly and Tim was watching him. Staring, actually. His grip on his drink was tight, his jaw clenched. Peter swallowed hard, but he didn't look away. Tim did first, but instead of leaving, he did something that made Peter's stomach drop. He grabbed the nearest girl and pulled her into a dance. Peter's heart pounded. Oh. So that was how this was going to go. If Tim wanted to play this game, Peter wasn't going to be the one to break first. He turned back to the guy he was dancing with, smiling even though his chest ached. But then, a hand wrapped around his wrist. Peter barely had time to react before he was being pulled out of the crowd, away from the noise, away from the suffocating tension. They stumbled into the hallway, and Peter found himself pressed against the wall, Tim standing inches away, breathing hard. "What the hell was that?" Tim snapped. Peter's head spun. "What was that? You tell me." Tim's hands clenched at his sides. "Why were you dancing with him?" Peter let out a short laugh, sharp and bitter. "Seriously, you're asking me that?" Tim exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't," he shook his head. "I don't like this, Pete." Peter's chest tightened. "Then what do you like?" Tim hesitated. His gaze flickered to Peter's lips, and suddenly the air between them felt different. Charged. "I don't know," Tim admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't stop thinking about you." Peter's breath hitched. And just like that, everything changed. Chapter 4, A Love That Shouldn't, But Could. The words hung in the air between them, thick with weight and meaning. "I can't stop thinking about you." Peter's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. Tim stood just inches away, his hands still clenched at his sides like he was fighting himself. His blue eyes, usually so easy and carefree, were stormy and uncertain. Peter's breath was shaky when he finally spoke. "Then why are you running from it?" Tim flinched slightly, his jaw tightening. "Because I don't know what to do with it." Peter swallowed hard, his own hands curling into fists. "You don't have to do anything, Tim. You just have to stop pretending it's not there." For a moment it seemed like Tim might actually close the distance between them. His gaze flickered to Peter's lips, his breathing uneven. Then he stepped back. Peter felt the cold absence instantly. Tim ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I need time." Peter stared at him, something heavy settling in his chest. "Time for what?" Tim's voice was hoarse when he answered. "To figure out who the hell I am." And with that, he turned and walked away. Peter watched him go, his heart twisting painfully. Maybe Tim needed time, but Peter wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. Days turned into weeks, and Tim didn't reach out. Peter told himself he was fine, that he was used to this, being overlooked, being the one left behind. But it was different this time, because this time he had felt something real, and now it was gone. The worst part was that Tim acted like nothing had happened. In class, he was still his usual self, laughing with his friends, flashing grins at people, acting like the world was as simple as it had always been for him. Except Peter saw it. The cracks. The way Tim's laughter didn't always reach his eyes. The way he avoided looking in Peter's direction. The way he ran anytime Peter got too close. It was frustrating, infuriating, and it hurt more than Peter wanted to admit. One evening, Peter found himself sitting across from Liam again. They weren't on a date, Peter had made that clear. But Liam had still noticed the shift in him. "Still hung up on him, huh?" Liam asked casually, sipping his coffee. Peter tensed. "What?" Liam smirked. "Come on, Peter. You've been staring at your drink for the last 10 minutes. Your mind is definitely somewhere else." Peter exhaled, rubbing his temples. "It's complicated." Liam chuckled. "It's always complicated." Peter shook his head. "No, I mean, it's Tim." Liam raised an eyebrow. "Ah, the golden boy." Peter sighed. "Yeah." Liam studied him for a moment before setting his cup down. "Let me guess. He's scared." Peter looked up, surprised. "How do you?" Liam shrugged. "I've seen it before. Guys like him, they don't let themselves feel things they can't explain. It scares them, so they push it away." Peter swallowed hard. "So what am I supposed to do? Just wait for him to stop being scared?" Liam hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "No," he said gently. "You live your life. And if he figures himself out, great. But don't let him keep you waiting in the dark." Peter exhaled shakily. He wanted to believe that, but he wasn't sure he knew how to stop waiting. The breaking point came at a party. Peter hadn't planned on going, but Leo had insisted. "You need a distraction, man. Seriously." So he went. And of course, Tim was there. Peter tried to ignore him, tried to focus on the people around him. But then he saw it. Tim. Standing close to some girl, leaning in as she laughed at something he said. It shouldn't have hurt. But it did. Something inside Peter snapped. Fine. If Tim wanted to pretend like nothing had changed, then Peter could too. That was how he ended up letting some guy pull him onto the dance floor, hands resting lightly on Peter's waist. It was reckless, petty, but for once he didn't care. Then, a hand grabbed his wrist, pulling him away from the crowd. Peter barely had time to react before he was pressed up against a wall in a quiet hallway. Tim. His blue eyes were furious. "What the hell are you doing?" Tim snapped. Peter scoffed. "Dancing, like normal people do at parties." Tim's jaw tightened. "With him?" Peter narrowed his eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I needed your permission." Tim exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "God, Pete, this isn't..." He shook his head. "You don't get it." Peter's chest ached. "Then explain it to me, Tim, because I'm done guessing." Tim hesitated. His gaze flickered to Peter's lips, and suddenly the air between them felt dangerous. "I don't know how to do this," Tim admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Peter's breath hitched. "Do what?" Tim swallowed hard. "Want you." The words sent a shiver down Peter's spine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Tim's hand reached up, fingers brushing Peter's jaw. Peter's heart pounded, his breath uneven. And just as Tim leaned in, someone called his name. Tim tensed. The moment shattered. He stepped back, shaking his head. "I can't." Peter's stomach dropped. Tim turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Peter standing there, heartbreaking, wondering if this was the end, or just the beginning. Chapter 5. Running from the Truth. Peter didn't chase after him this time. Maybe he should have. Maybe he should have grabbed Tim's arm, forced him to stay, made him admit that the things he had just said, the things he had almost done, meant something. But he didn't, because he was tired. Tired of the push and pull. Tired of Tim running every time they got too close. Every time something real slipped through the cracks in his carefully constructed walls. So Peter stayed in that empty hallway, heart pounding, fists clenched at his sides, and Tim ran, like he always did. The next few days were unbearable. Peter tried to focus on school, on assignments, on anything that didn't involve the ache in his chest. But it was impossible, because Tim was everywhere. They still had classes together. Peter still saw him across the room, sitting with his friends, laughing like nothing had happened. And the worst part? Tim was dating someone. Or at least, pretending to. It was all over campus. Tim and some girl from his business class. Holding hands in the hallway, sitting together at lunch, smiling in ways that looked just a little too forced. Peter wanted to believe it didn't affect him. That he was over it. That he was fine. But then he saw them together outside the library. Her arm draped over Tim's shoulder, whispering something in his ear. And suddenly, Peter wasn't fine at all. Because Tim wasn't looking at her. He was looking at him. And it was guilt in his eyes. Peter turned and walked away. The following night, Peter did something reckless. He went on a date. Not with Liam. Liam had figured things out before Peter even had, and while he was a good guy, he wasn't interested in being someone's second choice. No, this was with someone new. Someone Peter barely knew. A guy named Ryan, who had been sitting next to him in their literature class and had made casual conversation about poetry and coffee shops. Peter didn't really care about Ryan, but Ryan was nice. He asked about Peter's favorite books and actually listened when he answered, and most importantly, he wasn't Tim. So when Ryan invited him to dinner, Peter said yes. It was supposed to be a distraction. It didn't work, because halfway through the meal, Peter glanced up and Tim was there. Not alone. With her. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and something flickered across Tim's face. Something sharp and unreadable. Peter's stomach twisted. Tim shouldn't be here. Of all the places, of all the restaurants in this damn city. But he was. And he was watching. Ryan must have noticed the shift in Peter's expression, because he turned his head slightly. "You okay?" Peter forced a smile. "Yeah, just distracted." Ryan didn't push. Tim, however, looked miserable. And for the first time, Peter felt the power shift between them. Because now Tim was the one watching him with someone else. And he didn't like it. Not at all. The storm broke 2 days later. Peter was walking back to his dorm when he heard footsteps behind him. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Peter. He kept walking. "Pete, wait." Peter exhaled sharply, stopping in his tracks. "What, Tim?" He turned, arms crossed, staring at him. "What do you want?" Tim hesitated. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by something raw and uncertain. I wanted to. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling hard. That guy. From the restaurant. Peter narrowed his eyes. What about him? Tim hesitated. Are you dating him? Peter let out a short laugh, bitter and sharp. Seriously? Tim's jaw tightened. Just answer the question. Peter stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged. I don't know. Maybe? Tim flinched. Just barely, but Peter saw it. Something inside Peter snapped. What does it matter to you, Tim? He demanded. You're the one who ran. You're the one who keeps acting like this. This thing between us isn't real. So why do you care who I go out with? Tim opened his mouth, then closed it. Peter shook his head, anger and hurt mixing together in his chest. You don't get to be jealous. Not when you're walking around holding hands with some girl like none of this ever happened. Tim tensed. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Peter shot back. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like you're trying to convince yourself you don't feel something you clearly do. Tim exhaled sharply, looking away. Peter stepped closer, forcing him to meet his gaze. Say it, Tim. His voice was quiet but firm. Say you don't feel anything for me and I'll walk away. Right now, for good. Tim's breath hitched. He looked at Peter, eyes filled with something wrecked and helpless. But he didn't say it. And that was all Peter needed to know. Peter swallowed hard, stepping back. That's what I thought. He turned and walked away, and this time, Tim let him go. That night, Peter sat on his bed, staring at his phone. He knew he should move on. He wanted to move on, but he couldn't. Because no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he told himself he was done waiting, he still wanted Tim. And that was the worst part of all. Because wanting Tim Sinclair was like wanting a storm to stay still. It was impossible. But some part of him still couldn't stop hoping. Hoping that maybe, just maybe, Tim would stop running and finally come back to him. Chapter 6. The one he couldn't forget. Tim Sinclair was drowning. Not in the literal sense. His feet were planted firmly on campus grounds, his body moving through the motions of daily life. But in his head, in his chest, he was sinking. And it was all because of him. Peter. It had been weeks since the last time they spoke. Since Peter had stood there, unwavering and strong, demanding Tim tell the truth. Tim hadn't, because saying the words out loud would have meant giving in to something he had spent his whole life avoiding. Now, it didn't matter, because Peter was gone. Not physically. He still sat in their shared class, still walked the same halls, still existed in the same spaces Tim did. But he wasn't there anymore. Not for him. And it was Tim's fault. He had tried. God, he had tried to erase Peter from his mind. He had drowned himself in distractions. Friends, meaningless parties, forced smiles. A girl whose name he barely remembered. Nothing worked. Because no matter where he went, no matter who he was with, Peter was there, in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats. Tim would catch himself turning, expecting to see green eyes watching him from across the room. He would hear a sarcastic remark in his head, only to realize Peter wasn't beside him anymore. It wasn't just that Tim missed him. It was that he needed him. And he had been too much of a coward to admit it. But that was going to change, because Tim was done running. Peter didn't expect to see him that night. He had resigned himself to the reality that Tim was never coming back. That whatever had been between them, whatever almost was over. He had told himself he was okay with that. So when he walked into their literature lecture the following week and saw Tim already sitting in his usual seat, he barely acknowledged him. Tim, however, didn't look away this time. He was watching Peter, like he had something to say. Peter ignored it. Class started. The professor, as always, droned on about the power of words, the beauty of hidden meaning, the impact of vulnerability in literature. Peter might have laughed at the irony. But then, Tim stood up, in the middle of class. Peter blinked. So did the rest of the students. Tim didn't seem to care. He turned to Peter, right there in front of everyone, and said, "I need to talk to you." Peter's stomach dropped. Heat spread through the room. Whispers erupted. Peter clenched his jaw. "Not now, Tim." "Yes," Tim said firmly. The professor sighed. "Mr. Sinclair, if this is personal—" "It is personal," Tim admitted, eyes still locked on Peter. "And I need to say it now, or I never will." Peter's heart was pounding. Tim took a breath. "Look, I know I messed up," he started, voice steadier than Peter expected. "I know I ran. I know I hurt you. and I don't deserve a second chance after everything I put you through." The room was silent. Tim exhaled sharply. "But I also know that you're the only thing I've been able to think about for weeks, that nothing feels right without you in it, that no matter how hard I tried to pretend I could just move on." His voice caught. "I can't." Peter's chest ached. Tim ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. "I don't have all the answers. I don't know how to be good at this, or what it even means for me." His voice dropped slightly. "But I know I don't want to figure it out without you." Peter's fingers tightened on his notebook. Tim swallowed hard. "I'm in love with you, Pete." The words hit Peter like a crash of thunder, like a storm breaking open the sky. For a long moment, Peter didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, he stood up and walked out of the classroom. Tim caught up to him in the hallway. "Pete," Peter turned. "You don't get to do this." Tim froze. Peter's voice was shaking, but not with anger, with something bigger. "You don't get to say things like that in front of a room full of people. Like, that makes it real." Tim swallowed. "It is real." Peter exhaled sharply. "Then prove it." Tim didn't hesitate. He reached forward, grabbed Peter's face in his hands, and kissed him. The world around them blurred. Peter's breath caught, his body tensing in shock. But then, he melted. Because this wasn't just a kiss. It was an answer. A promise. A beginning. Tim's hands were trembling, his lips desperate but gentle, like he was afraid Peter would pull away. Peter didn't. When they finally broke apart, Tim rested his forehead against Peter's, breathing hard. "I'm all in," Tim whispered. "No more running. No more hiding." Peter let out a shaky breath, and for the first time in a long time, he believed him. Epilogue, the beginning of forever. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft golden streaks across the bed. The room smelled like coffee, old books, and something distinctly them. The warmth of the sheets wrapped around Peter as he stirred awake, stretching lazily against the mattress. Tim was still there. It had been months since that day in the lecture hall, since he had finally stopped running, but some part of Peter still half expected to wake up alone, to find that this was all some dream he hadn't meant to have. But Tim was real. His golden hair was messy, his breathing soft and steady beside Peter, his arm draped possessively over his waist. Peter smiled to himself, shifting slightly. Tim grumbled in response, tightening his hold without even opening his eyes. "Where do you think you're going?" Peter smirked. "You're awake." Tim cracked one eye open. "Barely." His voice was thick with sleep. "Stop moving. It's too early to be a functional human." Peter chuckled, pressing his face into the pillow. He could feel Tim smiling against his skin, his lips ghosting over his shoulder before he let out a satisfied sigh and nuzzled closer. This was what Peter had never let himself want before. Waking up to this. To him. To slow mornings and sleepy kisses, and the warmth of knowing that, for once, neither of them were pretending anymore. But things hadn't been perfect. The first few months had been an adjustment, Tim figuring out how to navigate something he had never let himself want before. Peter struggling with the fear that one day, Tim might change his mind. There had been late-night conversations, whispered admissions, and moments where Tim still hesitated. But every time, he chose Peter. That was what mattered. Later that morning, Peter sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through a book while Tim stood in the kitchen, fumbling with the coffee machine. "Okay, I think I finally got it," Tim announced proudly, holding up 2 mugs. Peter raised an eyebrow. "You mean you finally figured out how to work a basic coffee maker?" Tim scoffed. "Excuse me, but this thing has like 1,000,000 buttons." He placed one of the mugs in front of Peter, then plopped down beside him. "Taste it. I need validation." Peter took a sip. Immediately, his face scrunched up. "Oh my God, that's terrible," Tim groaned. "I tried." Peter laughed, setting the mug down. "A for effort." Tim rolled his eyes but leaned into Peter's side, letting their bodies press together. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence. Then, "Leo asked about us the other day," Tim said casually. Peter looked over at him. "Oh," Tim nodded. "He wanted to know if I was, like, out now. If this," he gestured between them, "was something I was comfortable with people knowing." Peter's heart clenched slightly. He had never pressured Tim to define himself, had never asked him to be anything other than his. But he also knew how much it had weighed on Tim, how long he had struggled with what it meant to want Peter in a way he had never wanted anyone else before. Peter shifted so he could see Tim's face better. And what did you say? Tim hesitated for only a second before he turned to meet Peter's gaze. I told him I don't care what people think, he said quietly. I don't care about labels or definitions. I just care about you. Peter's breath caught. Tim gave a small, nervous smile. And if that means the whole world knows, then good, because I want them to. Peter's throat felt tight. You mean that? Tim reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. I love you, Pete. His voice was steady. I'm done hiding it. Peter exhaled sharply, squeezing Tim's hand. That was the thing about Tim. He didn't do things halfway. So when he chose Peter, he chose all of him. Their first official outing as a couple came a few weeks later. Leo had invited them to a small gathering at his place, just a casual thing with a handful of their mutual friends. Peter had been wary at first, wondering if Tim would hesitate when it came to being affectionate in front of other people. But the second they walked in, Tim casually slid an arm around Peter's waist, pulling him close like it was the most natural thing in the world. Peter nearly melted on the spot. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a big moment. But it was everything. Later that night, when Tim had leaned down and pressed a kiss to Peter's temple in front of everyone, Leo had just grinned and muttered, "Finally!" Peter had rolled his eyes. Tim had just laughed and pulled him even closer. One evening, as they lay tangled together in Tim's bed, Peter traced absent-minded circles on Tim's bare shoulder. "You ever think about the future?" Peter murmured. Tim made a sleepy sound of acknowledgement. Peter hesitated. "And what do you see?" Tim shifted, propping himself up on one elbow so he could look down at Peter. His fingers brushed lightly against Peter's cheek. "You," Tim said simply. "I see you." Peter's heart nearly stopped. Tim grinned. "I mean, yeah, I also see myself being incredibly successful and probably still ridiculously attractive, but mainly you." Peter let out a laugh, swatting at him. "Idiot." Tim caught his wrist, bringing it to his lips. "But seriously," he murmured, his voice turning softer, "I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want us in it." Peter's chest tightened, because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. Weeks passed, then months. Life wasn't perfect. They still argued. They still had moments of doubt and insecurity, but they had each other. And every morning, when Peter woke up tangled in Tim's arms, he knew he had exactly what he had always been afraid to want. The love of a boy who once overlooked him. A boy who could never forget him now. And the beginning of forever.